Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring traditionalist eschatology. For those of you who may not know, eschatology means the study of final things, and in particular, we'll be looking at the afterlife. My guest is Charles Upton, the former beatnik poet who subsequently became engaged in metaphysics and the traditionalist movement, and is author of over 20 books, including Folk Metaphysics, Mystical Meanings in Traditional Folk Songs and Spirituals, Cracks in the Great Wall, UFOs, and Traditional Metaphysics, Knowings in the Arts of Metaphysics, Cosmology, and the Spiritual Path, The Science of the Greater Jihad, Essays in Principial Psychology, Vectors of the Counter-Initiation, The Course and Destiny of Inverted Spirituality, and The Way Forward for Perennialism After the Antinomianism of Fritjof Schuon. Charles is based in Lexington, Kentucky, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Charles. It's a pleasure once again to be with you.
Yeah, glad to be back.
And we'll be discussing one of my favorite topics, eschatology. Traditionalist eschatology is interesting to me, and I know we're going to approach this topic both philosophically and scholarly, but also in terms of some of your own personal explorations.
Yeah, and in traditionalist eschatology, or in the sense of what is the nature of the afterlife, it's basically taken from all the world's spiritual traditions. They don't have a particular take on it themselves. Just sort of a survey of of what the different traditions say. Although René Guénon made a point of saying he didn't believe in the literal reality of reincarnation, which is kind of a subtle thing because it's kind of real, and on the other hand, it's kind of not real. So, but that can. So I'd like to start with just some experiences which have to do, with perhaps one time I got close to death, and also experiences with people who have been close to me who have passed on. So
that's a good starting point.
In the early 70s, I was hippieing around in British Columbia. I went north to Canada. I didn't have to escape the draft because I had asthma and I had a chronic eye inflammation thing, and so the doctor said, "Don't worry, 4F." I didn't have to go to Vietnam. But since the hippies were traveling to Canada for that reason, it was sort of an exodus, I said, well, I'm going to go too. And actually also because down here I had met, my first serious live-in girlfriend who was, although she grew up in New York, she was from had been living with her parents in British Columbia in Vancouver. So we went north, and one of my experiences there was an automobile accident. I remember I was driving our hippie van, and I took a left, and I was going, oh, as I was turning, and I wasn't paying attention, and a car went wham, hit me, and I was knocked out. I got a concussion, and I remember I came to briefly while the ambulance was loading me onto the stretcher or whatever it was, and so they just took me in, and I came to. They X-rayed me, and they found I didn't have a fractured skull or a subdural hematoma, and so they shot me with some penicillin and gave me some pain pills and put me on the street. Socialized medicine. They didn't even ask. I was there illegally, but they didn't even ask. Things are not that cool in Canada now, but they're pretty cool then. So, but during that experience, the only thing I remember is I had come before like a review board or something like that. There was a semicircle of figures in front of me, maybe 7 of them. And, and I got the sense, although not explicitly, but just that they were giving me my marching orders for the next period of my life. Okay, this is the end of one of your lives in this life, and here's the next life in this life, and this is your instructions. I didn't hear the instructions. I just got the sense that that's what they were doing. So I called them my board of karma. So that's probably the closest I came personally to a near-death experience. So I've got a list here. But then it's interesting. After I got back from Canada, a lot of things happened to me in a very short period of time. I broke up with my girlfriend. I got in the automobile accident. I hippied around in the communes way up in the wilds of British Columbia, running into some very interesting but very disordered people who are obviously not going to be able to continue to be the kind of farmers they thought they could be with no problem, because they were smoking too much dope and all this. And then my parents, who were still in San Rafael, California, contacted me and they said, well, Lew Welch passed away, not passed away. Lew Welch has disappeared, who was a Beat Generation poet, who was my poetic mentor, and then they sent me another clipping and said, well, Lew Welch has been seen again. Apparently he's been found, or it was uncertain about what was going on. So that was it. So I came back. As I came back, friends drove me back to California, because I got to the point where I saw, I think I've outstayed my welcome here, because I was someplace way up in Prince Rupert near the Alaska Panhandle with some, this were the days where you go into town, you say, where do the hippies live? Oh, they live down there in such and such street. You go down and they give you a place to sleep. It didn't last long, but there it was, and so I was, and then RCMP officer came and he lifted me from the table I was at and took me to his car, and he was very happy because he'd finally, got his man. They always get their man. And I said, could you show me the picture of the guy you're looking for? And it looked just like me, except he had blue eyes and I had green eyes. And so I said, green eyes. And he went, oh, too bad. So I realized this was the time. Now it's the time to go home. When that starts to happen, go home. So I went back with friends, and I went to Gary Snyder's, whatever it is, his land in the Sierra foothills near Nevada City, Kitkadizzy. And I just met Snyder, who I'm known a little bit before. And I said, well, what about Lew Welch? Did he come back? And Snyder says, no, he never did come back. He just disappeared. So, leaving pretty much a suicide note, having traded his rifle for a handgun, which is much more convenient when you're trying to blow your brains out. And so then I went home, and pretty soon after that, everything started to go to hell. My father turned up with inoperable cancer. He died pretty quickly. And then the house that I'd grown up in burned, taking most of his beautiful paintings with it. And so it was, it's like I was burning up a lot of karma very fast, And so this leads to some stories about Lew Welch and my father. What happened with my father? I had a dream of him soon after he died, and I went to this. It was like a doctor's waiting room, with patients waiting to go see the doctor. Except there's this one lady who had a couple of Afghan hounds on leashes, which you usually don't see in a doctor's office, Otherwise, it was just like a doctor's office waiting room. And then I went and I saw my father, and he was lying just on a pallet on the floor. And he looked at me and he said, "Are you here already?" Which is very interesting. And I said, "No, actually, I'm dreaming. I'm just coming here in the dream state." And I said, "Well, you're dead, And he said, I guess what I did before that is I tried to embrace him. But as I embraced him, he turned into a moldering corpse. In other words, if I was going to embrace him, I would embrace only death. So don't hold on." Then I let go of him again. Once again, he was looked alive, except in another dimension. And I told him he was dead, and he said, "Oh yeah, all right, see ya." And he got up and just scurried off, And so that was my experience of my father after he passed on. With Lew Welch, what Lew Welch did is he set this thing up where he was going to turn into a turkey buzzard after he died. I don't know if anybody remembers, the famous Lew Welch buzzard cult, but this is what he did. He wrote a poem about, let's see if I could remember it, he says after he dies, he says, "On a marked rock following my orders, you place my meat. All care must be taken not to alarm the natives of this barbarous land who will not let us die even as we wish. With proper ceremony, disembowel what I no longer need so that it might more quickly rot and tempt my new form." And the new form is the buzzard, which will eat Lew's body, and Lew's spirit will pass into the buzzard, and now he will be like a buzzard god. That was his thing. And so many people at a certain point bought that, and they went with that. And when a buzzard would fly over and say, "Well, there goes Lew," he got people to do that, but that might not have been the best possible thing, because he was trying to hold on to life through other people's memory of him, right? Which is very common. That's poetic immortality, right? You will. William Butler Yeats wrote a poem where he talked about something where we wrought, who shall break the teeth of time, which means who shall attain poetic immortality and be remembered, for generation after generation. That's so he wanted to do that, and so his afterlife was probably not as happy as it might have been. After all, he was an alcoholic suicide, and suicides, mysteriously, they're trying to get out of life, but they're trying to hold on to life at the same time, because they're making, my life is my own to do with as I will. I can live if I want to, I can die if I want. And that's holding on. You're not saying, "God, if it's time for me to die, take me." It's like we have a prayer that we Sufis do every week. Make me die, Allah, if it's good for me to die, and let me live if it's good for me to live. That's the prayer. So he wasn't in a state where he could pray that, but he came back, I'm sure, to Gary Snyder, because Gary Snyder wrote a poem about him, which I know is from a dream. Snyder has some of the best dream poems that have ever been done. You just know that's a dream vision. I recognize that. So this is Snyder's poem about Lew. It's called From Lew. And it goes, "Lew Welch just turned up one day, live as you and me. Damn, Lew, I said, you didn't shoot yourself after all. Yes, I did, he said. And even then I felt the tingling down my back. Yes, you did too, I said. I can feel it now. Yeah, he said, there's a basic fear between your world and mine. I don't know why. What I came to say was teach the children about the cycles, the life cycles, all the other cycles. That's what it's all about, and it's all forgot. So that's the message he got from Lew. But strangely enough, before reading that poem and around about the same time, I had a dream about Lew Welch, which I put into this following poem. The last 4 lines of this poem were dictated to me in the poem, in the dream. So, this is word for word from the dream. So this is my dream that I had about Lew Welch around the same time. So I saw the sun set up in the distance like a temple on a plain, animals crashing through forests inside its face, and my dead teacher seated on the orbit of the earth, musing on his old love for earth and sun, and allowing himself sadly to forget it. This is the age when all stories have been told, the dead going on without poetry, and poetry telling them the truth of gravity's art. So that's what that was. And the interesting thing is, Lew was telling Gary about the cycles, and I was seeing him sit. It's like he was sitting on the orbit of the Earth, looking toward the sun, and that's a cycle. That's a circle. And so that was Lew Welch. And then one other thing is, a couple of times it's like he sent me a buzzard feather. Like I found a buzzard feather hiking around. One time, my wife and I were hiking in Indian Valley College, if you know where that is, up near Novato, north along 101. And it's funny, I heard something like the sound of a cougar, that breathing, kind of, whatever sound they make. And I've never seen a cougar in Marin County, though they have been reported. And then I looked and I found a buzzard feather on the ground, and I thought, well, this is from Lew, And it's either that, I forget, or an earlier one that I got in a similar way. See, the funny thing is, the reason I went to Indian Valley College is I had this terrible sensitivity at the base of my skull. Just felt awful. I had to put my hands over that part of my body, or I would not. My thoughts would be totally disarranged. So something was coming in and was difficult, at that point. And so the thought was, I got to go to Indian Valley College, and so that's how I found that feather. So either that feather or an earlier one I sent to. Somehow there was an ad for a Dzogchen Lama who was living in Tibet, who would pray for people in the bardo after in the after-death state. So I said, well, I Xeroxed up a picture of Lew Welch, and I put it in a $20 bill and that feather, and I sent it, through the mails. God knows if it ever got there, to the Dzogchen Lama, because I knew Lew needed some help. And then the other feather, I remember I was probably smoking dope, and I decided because I can never keep magical objects. When I was dabbling in magic, I would produce magical objects or be given magical objects, and they were always just, they collected so much projection so fast, they became heavy and I would always give them away. This time I burned that feather in our fireplace.
With the same feather, a different feather?
Yeah, I think that was a feather earlier than the one I was talking about, or it may have been later. I don't remember. There were two anyway. And this one I burned. And, in my mind's eye, Lew Welch appeared, as if he was sort of in the coals of the fire. And he said, things don't change here as fast as I thought they would. So that was the state he was in, which is probably common for people who are, suicide. I mean, Dante, in the Inferno had a circle of the suicides, and they turned into trees. They were rooted, they couldn't move. They were rooted to the earth. It's funny. They wanted to get away from the earth, so bad, but they end up rooted to the earth and unable to move. So that's Lew Welch. We hope he's moved on. And I think he's moving on. He's somewhere better than that now, I trust. So, but then let's see. My wife had a dream about Rama Kumaraswamy, who's the son of Ananda Kumaraswamy, one of the co-founders of the Traditionalist school. And I remember before he died, I just had a dream of him just looking radiantly happy, which he did not in life because he had a very long case of bone cancer, which went for year after year after year. And he would almost die and he would get the last rites and then he'd have a remission and he'd come back and he'd be cancer-free for a while and then it would come back and it went on and on. So, but here he was looking happier than I ever remember him. And soon after that, he passed on. And then soon after he passed on, my wife had a dream of him, and he was standing on a seashore beyond which was this vast ocean. And he said to her, well, I am dying. He didn't say I'm dead. He said, I am dying. He's in the process, of death, which is not just simple, right? And he said, and you're one of the people I wanted to, to contact and say goodbye to before I passed on. And he would talk to her, then he would keep looking out to the vast ocean and looking back to her and then looking out to the ocean. So that was, experience of him.
I trust she actually did know him.
Oh yeah, we knew him. And, we would go, we only met him 2 or 3 times, once in Louisville and once in his house in Connecticut. And, but we were in contact by phone a lot. And he was really a spiritual guide. Of all the traditionalists, he was the closest thing to an effective spiritual guide, because he was a traditional Catholic. He actually, I have on my computer a whole book he wrote of dialogue with Mother Teresa, except all he got from Mother Teresa is a couple of little short postcard length things. What he was trying to do, he saw the Catholic Church throwing away its ancient traditions after Vatican II, and he wanted Mother Teresa to see what he saw and to go to the Pope and say, you can't do this. Mother Teresa was not interested in doing that. And she just said, oh, Ram, you're hurting Jesus. We have to obey the Pope. Otherwise we'll hurt Jesus. And that's as far as he got. He was actually Mother Teresa's cardiologist, because he was a surgeon, heart surgeon at one point. Then he got ill. And so he quit that practice, retrained as a psychiatrist, and was ordained as a traditional Catholic priest by lineages, one or another lineage of bishops in the traditional church, which is the church that believes all the popes since Pius XII are invalid, and that the Vatican II, Second Vatican Council, was the great apostasy. But he was ordained by one of those bishops, and he worked with Father Malachi Martin in the New York area as an exorcist for a while. So he had a lot of experience, exorcism, and it's understandable because he really wanted to know, because if you're going to do exorcism, you have to be able to separate mental illness from demonic possession or obsession. And so to be a psychiatrist at the same time was, certainly useful. So, that's what he did. And then he was very helpful to us. And my wife would not be a traditional Catholic today, I'm reasonably sure, if it wasn't for him. So, anyway, but last I'm going to talk about, this is a little difficult, and I was wondering if I was going to talk about this, but it does illustrate something, and so I think it needs to be said, is my wife's mother, a very difficult person. She passed away some years ago. Very narcissistic, actually very cruel, not just cruel through insensitivity, but cunningly cruel, deliberately cruel. And she would use lies for the explicit purpose of hurting people. So, not in the best state. So, So she had apparently something like a near-death experience, which he never, explained to us. But she was once in the hospital, very near death, and then the doctor came out. I wasn't there. I think this is before we had moved to Kentucky. We were still in California. The doctor came out and says, well, to the family, and says, well, I'm terribly sorry. I think we've lost her. And pretty soon after that, this minister appeared. And he just walked in and he says, is Lola Tackett here? And I said, well, yeah, she may have passed on. He says, I need to pray for her. Where is she? And he went and he prayed for her. And they said, well, who are you? Are you a friend of the family? Oh, yes, her husband called me. Well, the truth is her husband had not called him. Somebody else called him, probably an angel, because he just knew she needed that and came from nowhere, prayed for her, and she got better. She did not die. And when she came back, she said, well, now I've seen the other side, more or less something on those lines, and I've lost my fear of death, which is very common, what people say about near-death experiences. The problem is she still had no fear of God. She had lost her fear of death, which is good, to the degree that a neurotic, obsessive fear of death is not, is going to stand in your way in life as well as in death. And so that's good, but it didn't improve her character at all. She was just as cruel, till the day she died. And I think this shows one of the limitations of some of the near-death experiences that are being reported now. I hear things like, well, I found out that there was no judgment. Too much. Whatever we do, it's okay. Even Hitler is immediately forgiven. It's no problem. God is unconditional love. Well, God is unconditional love, but as the Eastern Orthodox, saints or sages will say, God is unconditional love, but if you resist that love, it becomes hellfire for you. So that love is also hell, depending upon your state. And so what I see with these near-death experiences, they're not all like that. Some people, have a near-death experience and they go to hell temporarily, right? Because they need to be scared straight. And more or less they're being told, well, this is what's going to happen to you, Buster, if you keep on the way you are. Look at this. You want this? And they will often call to God to save them, and God will save them and take them out of hell. Well, that happens, but there's a tendency to say what we've learned is that there's no judgment. And I don't think that's a good idea, because with near-death experiences, they're near death. They're not death. They're not death. The people come back to life, and apparently the beings on the other side, whether they be angels or guides or whatever you call them, or deceased relatives or God, will say, well, you can't stay here. It's time for you to go back. And they very often say, no, I want to stay. And sorry, you have to go back. You have work to do. And you agreed to. That's the general story you're getting from today's near-death experiences. And, because the reason that there is no judgment, as far as I can see, is because they haven't died, and the people on the other side know they're not going to die. They're going to go back. So my feeling is people who actually, die and do not go back, the karma that has been stored in this life, all the effects of their actions in this life starts to come toward them and dawn upon them, and it becomes a series of veils over that unconditional love of God, to the point where they will go into some other state, sometimes very hellish, and because if there's no judgment, then God is not just, and if God is not just, then He's imperfect. We can't have that because that's not God. Whatever you're talking about, that's not God. So the people who have an experience of unconditional love, no matter what they had done, God loves me no matter what I did. Well, in a sense, He did, because He created you perfect, and He sees you in your original perfection, and He loves His own creations as reflections of Himself. That's true, but there are other levels going on. What you have done with the gift of existence, and I think it's necessary to accept that there is also a judgment, and it's interesting also the people who say, "Oh, I saw that God was just pure unconditional love without judgment," tend to be people who said, "I expected God to be the God I was taught to believe in, who was vengeful and mean and was going to tell me I was going to go to hell and I was a horrible person." So obviously, people have been taught a very negative view of God. They don't look at Him as loving at all. They look at Him as vengeful, and so this is a compensatory experience to that bad teaching about God. No, look, here I am as unconditional love. That's what I really am. But people get those experiences to teach them something they need to know for this life. This does not mean this is what will finally happen to them when they pass on for good, and the entirety of their life has to be weighed and evaluated, to determine what their next state of existence will be. It's something. It's an inspiration for their spiritual life now while they're alive, because that's what it would have to be, because everybody on the other side knows they're coming back, and so they are given the experiences they need to help them through their various spiritual problems and impasses in this life. It's not the same thing as judgment. Father Seraphim Rose, who wrote a book, very interesting book called The Soul After Death, he said something similar. People haven't gotten far enough into the death experience because they haven't actually died. Therefore, they haven't encountered judgment yet. There's a degree of judgment in the idea of the life review, particularly the kind of life review where you experience yourself all the pain that you have caused other people. That's beginning to be a real judgment. Okay, but so in any case, the idea that when you die you're off the hook. I mean, that's what any suicide believes, except he believes he or she is off the hook because he will cease to exist. But it's the same problem. I mean, death is the free ticket out of karma. No, it's not. Death is the dawning and the final evaluation of karma. So just, want to give that caution to people who, have certain attitudes toward near-death experiences. Seeing the near-death thing, there's a constant attempt to standardize it, and also a lot of people are working against standardizing it because they know that experience has many more dimensions than can be put into this simple. The simple story is I was in the hospital. I was really sick, and I was out of my body, and I saw my body, on the bed, and then I flew out of the hospital, and I went into darkness, and then there was a point of light appeared in the darkness, which turned into a tunnel, and I went through the tunnel, and I came out on the other side, and I came out maybe into a beautiful earthly paradise, and I met dead relatives, and I met angels and guides, and then, and I was immersed in divine love, and then the divine love opened the door to something like infinite knowledge. And then, I went beyond that even to higher reaches where I met God Himself, and I transcended my individuality. And, well, that's an interesting, that's an important story. It's a sort of a dominant theme in all those experiences, but there's so many exceptions to that, so many other ways it can go. And I think it's just important that people keep realizing that, don't standardize it, because it will become a cliche, and, that will not be helpful. So, because there's something, near-death experiences are like the LSD of the 21st century. Because LSD, I was there when it first came in, and there was about 4 years when it was immensely transformative because it broke set. I mean, the idea you can take a pill and get an experience like this and see God or whatever you were supposed to do, it just had an incredibly transformative and disordering effect on society. It was powerful. And now you don't hear about it so much. I mean, there's, psychedelics are creeping back as treatments for depression or alcoholism. And, there's maybe some application there. But this whole spiritual revolution that came with LSD, it didn't last long, because it was 90% a break in set, not just the effect of a drug. So maybe near-death experiences will have a similar fate, or maybe not. But because they seem to be more valid than LSD. First, you didn't ask for them. You didn't say, I'm going to take a drug and see what it does to me. This is something that happens to you. And so there's obviously something deeper in your destiny that is being manifest than just deciding to take a psychedelic. But, if it gets too standardized, the same thing will happen to near-death experiences that happened to LSD, which is, oh yeah, LSD, sure. I remember a hippie I met in British Columbia once at like one of those, it was a youth hostel or some kind of temporary shelter where hippies were staying as they were traveling through. And this one guy was saying, unity is boring. It's like LSD, you take LSD, you're united with infinite truth. So what, I want something else. I want something more entertaining, So, it could become a cliche, but let's hope it doesn't. That's all I'm saying.
Well, what an interesting exposition. It seems you're really, speaking from the heart, talking about your own personal experiences. And I get the impression that you're saying that the traditionalist approach accepts sort of the folk ways having to do, like, for example, dreams and the intersection between dreams and the afterlife.
Yeah, it would accept that, because that's important in Sufism. It's important. It's reported from Christian saints and other Catholic believers and Eastern Orthodox believers, and it's certainly that's part of the universal lore of human spiritual experiences. So that's accepted. It's not, particularly emphasized, but so what I could do at this point is, now there are two of the writers who have something interesting to say about eschatology are René Guénon, who's pretty much the founder of the Traditionalist school, and Frithjof Schuon, who is the school's last real leader. Not that everybody accepted him as that, but you could call him that. And what Schuon contributed is he just did an overview of eschatology, and he called it universal eschatology. It was a chapter in his book Survey of Metaphysics and Esotericism, and he just talked about the different. His view was the different ideas of the afterlife from the different traditions. Some of which accept reincarnation, some of which don't. For example, basically have to do with the state of soul of the person, going into the next world. And there's different levels depending upon the spiritual development of the person who goes in, different levels that one experiences. And these levels are 5, actually. And they are, okay, the first one is just, the saints who are immediately translated into glory after they die, who die and go right to heaven because, they're purified to the degree that there's nothing holding them back, and they come into the presence of God and the beatific vision, rather swiftly. And that's one. The next one is the one talked about in the pure land of Amida Buddha from that kind of Buddhism which believes in the Buddha more or less as a divine figure whose help you invoke. And there's the Western paradise of Amida, which is a pure land. A pure land is like a land on the imaginal plane, which is understood to be an apparition, and yet it's very effective and potent nonetheless. It's not just a mere apparition. It's an apparitional land. And this is where the story is people go and they become as if they were little embryos again inside of huge lotus flowers on the vast lake of the other world. And the lotus flowers open and they slowly sit there under a rain of grace, as it were, and ripen to the point where they can attain Buddhahood and liberation, slowly just, ripening in this elevated environment until finally, they too can have what the Christians would call the beatific vision, but it just takes a while. Okay. The next lower level is purgatory, and purgatory is where people pass on, and in their essence, they're oriented toward God and toward truth, and that's what they've chosen. And yet, there's a lot of purification they haven't done. There's a lot of impurities and karma, associated, attached to their soul, and that they have to be purified of it. And this is more or less a state of suffering where, it's rather excruciating to have to let go of these things that you haven't been able to let go of in life. Now, you're getting closer and closer to the face of truth, to the face of God. And so these purities have to be burned away before you can really come into direct vision and union with that face. So it's hard, and it's easier or harder depending upon the thickness of your karma. And so that's purgatory. So then lower than that is transmigration or wandering in samsara. This is where you're not really oriented toward truth. You haven't developed a clear enough intuition of God in this life, or of absolute truth, whatever it should be called. And so you end up going to other states of existence. And those states may be better or worse, but you're like moving horizontally from, you're wandering, you're and it's not a particularly auspicious state, because God knows where you will end up, turning into different forms, attracted to different worlds that don't last, and you go on and on and on, and you'll have to get back to something like the human form. You may lose the human form at that point, become other sorts of beings who are not as capable of directly experiencing divine reality and absolute truth. That's what the human being is, according to the Buddhists, is the human state hard to attain, is the only state from which enlightenment can really be reached. And they say it's as rare to attain this state as, imagine, there's a plank of wood with a big hole in it floating out in the ocean somewhere, and a sea turtle at one time might surface and put his head through that plank, and then swim with that plank around his neck. But that's not going to happen very often. And it says it's that rare to reach the human state. And only from the human state can one truly reach enlightenment or liberation. And this is in Islam, in the Quran, this is what is called the amana, the trust. And it says, Allah offered the trust to the heavens, the earth, and the hills, but they were afraid of it and they ran away from it. That's too much responsibility for us. And they say, and he says, and man assumed it. So man has the trust. Then it says, lo, he hath proved a tyrant and a fool. Well, that's another story. But, we as Schoen and the traditionalists would say, we're the axial or central beings for this state of existence. We're the center of the whole thing. And that's unpopular nowadays because we say, well, we've been so destructive to nature and we're the weird animal. All the other animals are cool, but the human beings are weird. And wouldn't it be better if we were all raccoons or something? Well, no, we have to be human beings because we have an immense destiny that we've largely forgotten. That's one of the tragedies of our time. So wandering in samsara is not a good idea. And then, the lowest of the five is hell, where you have turned away from God. You've said no. You've probably been given a chance to know God and see him. And you'd say, no, I don't want that. I want to be me. And God is God. He has no rights over me. And I don't want, I don't even believe in him anymore. And I'm going to hold on to my self-will and my way of doing things. And okay, God may be able to control me in every other way, but one thing he can't take away from me, one thing that is mine, is my self-determination, is I can see myself damned. I can destroy myself for all eternity, and that's something not even God can prevent me from doing. People get in that state. They get that defiant, and those are the people who end up in hellfire for God knows how long. I do not believe that hellfire is literally eternal. I'm following the traditionalists in this because it would be sort of a shame if God's eternity, has a dark partner, which was hell forever. That's kind of a problem. And that's what people complain about Manichaeism, as whether it actually said that, I don't know, but that's what they think of Manichaeism as saying, radical dualism between principles of good and principles of evil. I don't believe that. But hell might as well be eternal because every split second of it is like an eon, So it's because it's that hard. So anyway, Schoen just goes over the different afterlives from the different traditions and sees them more or less as a hierarchy, talking about different states of soul, from the most purified to the most rebellious and corrupt. So one thing I should say about afterlife, after my wife's mother passed on, I had a dream about her. And so you lived in San Rafael, right?
I sure did.
Yeah. Okay. So you remember San Rafael High School?
Yes, I live nearby.
Yeah, right. And so remember Summit Drive that came up from San Pedro Road and went over the little ridge and then turned into Deer Park Drive and came down.
I lived right in that neighborhood.
By Dominican.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So I was living in here in Kentucky at the time, but I went back there and I saw. I was standing there and looking down into the down the hill where San Rafael High School was. And on the upslope, there was a new building. It was like a several-story wooden building, and but more or less on the grounds of San Rafael High School. And I looked, and in the lowest of the stories, there was my wife's mother sitting there alone in a room, looking sad, and in that room, there was just one little vase with a single flower in it. And that was her afterlife, And I looked at that and I said, well, I guess she isn't in hell, because it was like saying she just didn't get it. She had to go back to kindergarten. The lowest of the stories of this building on the grounds of this school is like, first grade or kindergarten. You have to go back and start over and learn your spiritual ABCs because you didn't get it this time. And so she had her little vase and her single flower, which was like her little helping of the mercy of God, and it was there. And, it was just going to be a long a long course she would have to take to learn what she needed to learn, because she was kind of clueless. And, somebody who's clueless will sometimes get mean because they know something's terribly wrong, and everybody else seems to have to understand something they don't understand. And so they get, it's hard on them, and sometimes they get mean. And I think that's what happened to her. So I saw that she was, she was starting over, but starting in a better way, hopefully, so.
Well, in all of these accounts, one theme that I see that seems to pervade them all is that the soul remains intact. Something of the character, the personality, it's not extinguished. You don't just dissolve into the pool of consciousness.
No, or if you do, it takes an awful lot of development. And in a certain sense, I don't think you ever do, because if you ever existed, then you do exist, because in God's eternity, he sees all past and future as one, and your eternal potentiality within him is never annihilated. So, yeah, I mean, it sort of goes without saying for me that, as they say, human consciousness survives bodily death. I took that for granted, more or less, in everything I said. Didn't try to prove it, because it's so, obvious to me that I didn't, I forgot that I had to prove it.
Well, there are many ways human consciousness might survive without there being an intact personality.
Well, what is, there's the personality which is composed of all of your identifications and your memories, and all of it. To see all those memories might go. Why do you need to remember all the details of your life in the next life, of your past life? You don't. So, in a certain sense, but consciousness, I am is a very deep thing. Shankara, the great Vedantic sage Shankaracharya, said in one of his writings, we think of me saying I am as an expression of ego, and so as a sort of a limitation on the vast ocean of consciousness. Now I'm just little me saying I am. And that's true. In a certain sense, it's a veil. It's something that hides the greater reality. But Shankara also said the very fact that you say to yourself, I am me, is a sign of the Atman, of the absolute witness within you, of the divine I am within you, that transcends the ego. So the ego is not just a veil over the self with a capital S. It's also a sign of a self, the self with a capital S. So that's interesting, because we're not for nothing were we born. Not for nothing did we become whoever we think we are. Yet certainly our narrow vision of reality is based a lot upon the development of an artificial ego based upon the identification with various things. I am this in the world. I have this. I've had these experiences. Or, even in the inner world, these are the inner archetypes that I identify with. It's a complex of ego, and it is to be transcended. But on the other hand, it has a significance that it can't simply be discounted.
Earlier, you talked about karma, and as I recall, you said there has to be divine justice, otherwise God wouldn't be perfect. And but karma is typically associated with reincarnation, and I know the traditionalists tend not to accept reincarnation, at least the popular versions of it. I think that reincarnation might be our best stab at trying to describe something far more complex than human language allows for.
Yeah, I think that's correct. That's correct, because now here we can get to what René Guénon said about that, and Guénon wrote some wonderful things on Vedanta, including a man and his becoming according to the Vedanta, which is a classic and probably one of the first books that really dealt with the essence of Vedantic teachings in any Western language. Maybe I'm wrong, but I mean, it's an early classic of Western writing on Indian religion. And but he would say, well, the doctrine of reincarnation was never really traditionally taught. Now, I don't know about that. There's an awful lot of swamis who I think have come forward and say, sorry, we've always taught that. So he may have been a little abrupt in saying that, but his reason for saying it is very interesting, because it may be in a Upanishad. I forget exactly where it came from, but it's from a Hindu scripture where it says Brahman, the absolute, is the one and only transmigrant. Only Brahman transmigrates. Now that is a mysterious thing to say, because the absolute exists everywhere, in all places and times, in everything and beyond everything. So how could that absolute reality come down into a little soul that transmigrates from body to body? I mean, it's almost it's a paradoxical statement. So if the absolute is the one and only transmigrant, then it's something like saying the fact that there's a single soul, which I call me, Charles Upton, and then Charles Upton moves to another body in another lifetime in which he's no longer called Charles Upton, he's called somebody else. That is a lower level projection of something deeper, which ultimately is that the absolute is the only transmigrant, because the absolute actually can't transmigrate, is already wherever the transmigrating soul would end up. The absolute Brahman is already there. So, it's very hard to talk about. But in other words, it's saying that at the very least, reincarnation is sort of a lower level, relatively illusory experience that is transcended by the realization of God, of the absolute. And that's pretty much what the Hindus say, and even the Buddhists. For them, reincarnation is an unfortunate occurrence. One of the things, Guénon didn't like the idea of what the spiritualists were saying about reincarnation, because their attitude was more spiritual evolution. For each lifetime you get better and better and better. It's wonderful. If you don't succeed in this lifetime, you could just reincarnate and pick up where you left off and move ahead. And he didn't like that so much, because that's not what the Hindus and Buddhists said. They said, move ahead, or maybe you're going to move backwards. Now, in other words, you're wandering in a samsara, and what you have to do is get off the wheel of birth and death. That's the goal, not just getting better and better lifetimes, because they won't necessarily be better. Karma is imponderable. Sometimes, you do good, and then you get better, and then you get complacent, and you start to do evil, then you get worse, and God knows what's going to happen. So just try to get out of that whole, transcend becoming and come into being, where you're not just almost something, or almost, become who you're supposed to be, or not quite, go into being where who you are always is in God. That's liberation. So anyway, Guénon talked about three things. He said there is reincarnation, there is metempsychosis, and there is transmigration. And he accepted metempsychosis and transmigration and said reincarnation, at least literally understood, as an illusion. And reincarnation is the idea that one soul goes from body to body, in a horizontal line. And he said experiences, and there are stories of people who remember former lifetimes very clearly. Sometimes in India, the child would say, "Oh yeah, they took a trip to the neighboring village," and the child will say, "Oh yeah, I used to live here." And they say, and then, my name was so and so, and oh, there's my aunt, and they check it out, and it's true, he does remember the lifetime of this other person, In fact, I had an experience like that when my wife and I were living in Petaluma in a dinky little apartment. My father came in a dream and said, "It's time to move into your grandmother's house," which the family still owned. And so we did. But what happened is the lady who was there, who had been a longtime tenant, ended up being evicted, and here's some karma I may have to deal with. And she passed on pretty soon after that. So, and my wife and I more or less needed that to survive, and yet somebody had to pay for it. And what's interesting is there's a kid who was born after she passed on, somewhere else in the neighborhood. And he came over to the house once, I forget for what. He looked around and said, "Oh, I used to live here." I said, "Oh, yeah." So this is pretty interesting. But what Guénon would say about this is that this is psychic inheritance, metempsychosis. Somebody dies and they release the psychic material. And the people who release psychic material are people who are not completely integrated. If you're a saint, all your psychic material is transmuted and offered to the spirit. Whereas if somebody is pretty disoriented or disintegrated in their life and they die, they'll leave behind a lot of material. This is where you get ghosts, where people, an alcoholic dies somewhere and apparently he doesn't know he's dead, and his ghost is still walking around trying to go to the same bars, and this kind of story, or people who have died in violence and haunt the places where they were murdered and all of this. This is people whose souls are not integrated, leave behind what Guénon would call psychic residues or psychic corpses. And this is why he didn't like spiritualism as it was practiced in his time, because he said that these mediums are just calling up these psychic corpses, who are not the complete human being, just some shadow of the human being left behind, And so he went a little far. He said, well, it's impossible to contact the dead because they're in an entirely different state. I don't necessarily believe that. I believe the dead can contact us. I don't think it's a good idea to try to contact the dead in that sense with like with mediums. It's not a healthy thing for them or for us. But if, by God's permission or God's command, they are able to come back and tell us something, that's a different level. That's what I think. But in any case, he didn't like what the spiritualists were up to with, there's Uncle Joe, I see him fishing in the next world. And the relative says, "Oh, that's Uncle Joe. He loved to fish," Well, this is not like the experiences people are reporting with near-death experiences. This is kind of a psychic shadow of who the person used to be. It's a different thing. So Guénon had a problem with the spiritualists, but he said the stories of reincarnation, it's like you inherit stuff. And, like someone passes away and you inherit their library or maybe some of their clothes. And, you wear the clothes of the person who's passed on, you read their books, and they're obviously affecting you by what they left behind. But does that mean that you are their reincarnation? No. So people who pass on can actually, leave memories that other people can pick up. And so you remember being that other person because you inherited their memory. That's the way he explained that. And he said, now transmigration, on the other hand, is the motion of the soul through various worlds. higher or lower worlds beyond death, but it's not just coming back to another human body over and over again. So he accepted transmigration, but not reincarnation. So what's interesting with me, I more or less remembered some former lifetimes. And the two I remember were not very positive. Once, after my Aunt Barbara's husband, Charles, passed away from brain cancer. And I went down to visit her. She lived in Beverly Hills, California. I went down to visit her as a child, or like I was 14 or something like that. And somehow down there, I remembered another lifetime. I said, "Oh, I was this junky jazz musician, not a very good jazz musician, probably a saxophone player who was a junkie and died early of an overdose." I remember being that person, and this is funny because as a child, I would call my mother and father Mommy-o and Daddy-o, which is beat lingo, beat lingo, I should say. And I hadn't heard those terms. I just picked them up. That's the way I talked. That's what I called them. So, and then I said, "Oh yeah." And then you think, well, I got that way of talking from being having been a beatnik jazz musician junkie. Okay, that's the little piece of something there. And the other one was apparently another lifetime. I was a member of the SS who was part of Hitler's staff at the Berghof in near Berchtesgaden. His mountain retreat. And how do I know that? Well, when I was young, I invented an insignia for myself, which was like a combination of a swastika and one of those S symbols for the SS, the one of the rune symbols, which represents lightning, I think. So it was that the rune symbol with a circle around it and a line through it, so it looked halfway like an SS symbol and halfway like a swastika. And that was my insignia, And then I remember there was a rock, because we lived on the shore of San Francisco Bay, and there's a rock sitting on the shore with a particular gray, bunched up quality, hard to describe, but I called that rock the Eagle's Nest for some unknown reason. Why would I call it that? It had nothing to do with eagles, But then I was looking on Google Images, and I was looking at the Berghof, Hitler's Berghof, and I saw, a rock that looked very much like that. It was much bigger, and I said, well, that looks just like the rock that was off my, on the shore of the bay as I was a child, and of course he called the Berghof the Eagle's Nest. That was his name for his mountain retreat. So I said, oh yeah. And then beyond that, when I was in British Columbia, living in this, room there was nothing in the room but a scrap of foam rubber and my sleeping bag. And I was eating food from a hot plate and this and there. But next to me was this little astrologer. I mean, he was so short, he was almost a midget, He had long, longer than shoulder length, straight, fine hair and a fine little beard. And he was like an elf, And one time he says, I had a dream about you. And I said, what? Oh, well, I dreamt that you were a Nazi hiding out in the Himalayas, pretending to be a Tibetan holy man, I said, oh, yeah? Which is interesting given that, Heinrich Harrer, who wrote 7 Years in Tibet, was actually an SS officer who made it to Tibet out of internment in India during World War II and spent a lot of time with the Dalai Lama, and taught him about the West and helped him do little works of irrigation. And it was a very interesting book if you ever read that. But he was an SS.
It was made into a movie as well.
Yeah, with Brad Pitt. Yeah, yeah. And so anyway, oh yeah, so I was a Nazi, and then the other part of the Tibetan connection is when I was a child, my mother had a dresser in her bedroom, and there, at the bottom part of the dresser were these curtains, these maroon colored curtains, and out of that dresser to me came a smell. It was very distinctive, and the smell wasn't actually there. I mean, I checked it out, but it was sometimes I associated that with a smell. And as a child, I believed that a dragon lived in that dresser, behind the maroon curtains. And then in this life, I actually encountered that smell, and it was with some meeting with Tibetan lamas, and that was Tibetan incense. I said, "Oh, I remember that smell. Oh yeah." And guess what? They wore robes of exactly the same color as those curtains of my mother's dresser. So what you have is all these reflections of other lifetimes, in this lifetime. Well, that's real, But the funny thing is, that jazz musician probably died after I had been born. Right? So how could I be the reincarnation of him, how could it didn't work out? If I was an SS officer at Hitler's Berghof, I couldn't, time wise, that couldn't have been an earlier lifetime of the junkie jazz musician. In other words, it didn't line up.
Presuming that reincarnation follows linear time.
Yeah, it doesn't follow. Yeah, it doesn't follow linear time, but you could say in a simpler way, when someone dies, you and you are alive, you can pick up psychic residues from them, and you can become a reincarnation of them somewhere later than your own birth. So now I remember this happening with William Blake. There was a moment when Blake came to me, and then after that, I was sort of the reincarnation of William Blake. But, I wasn't born the reincarnation of William Blake. I became the reincarnation of William Blake at the age of 18 or something, So this shows that psychic material from people who have passed on is there in some dimension, and it can become part of your psychic makeup either at birth or sometime later than birth, and this is more or less what metempsychosis is. And that's my experience of something similar to reincarnation, but not exactly literally reincarnation.
Well, it involves some kind of an affinity with two particular individuals, one in the present and one in the past. And it's also suggestive of the possibility, perhaps, of something akin to a group soul.
Yeah, I think so. It's as if you're different branches on the same tree. Not like you're connected branch to branch as if by a parasitic vine, but you're connected through the root. You're connected through the origin of that whole family of souls. And as much as I hate to refer to anything of a new age variety, there's something like that in the Seth material.
Yes,
Yeah, and I think because there are problems with the Seth material, especially you would see how essentially anti-Christian and anti-religious he was, but there are some definite truths in there as well. So.
Yeah, you probably don't know, Charles, but I actually am the co-author of an alternative theory to reincarnation known as archetypal synchronistic resonance.
Ah. Is what I've been saying anything like that?
Oh, it could be, possibly. The irony is that not so long ago, I wrote a foreword to James Matlock's book, about reincarnation. I think it's titled Signs of Reincarnation, in which I had to acknowledge that some of the evidence, particularly the physical evidence where the death wounds of one person, the previous personality, show up as the birthmarks of the young child who remembers that personality, I began to think that archetypal synchronistic resonance may cover many examples, but not necessarily all of them.
Yeah, well, so anyway, that's more or less what René Guénon said about reincarnation and et cetera, et cetera. So
René Guénon didn't have access to the immense database of reincarnation cases that we have today.
Right. But and certainly there's a lot of evidence suggestive of reincarnation, but it could be explained just as well, I think, by metempsychosis. So I just don't like the feeling of reincarnation. I don't say, in my next lifetime, I think I want to be, I don't do that. I say, oh, if I have to come back to this godforsaken place, I deserve what I get. That's basically my attitude toward reincarnation.
Well, going back for a moment to the idea of the judgment, and you alluded briefly to the past life review and or the life review, how that might be akin to a form of judgment. It's only reported in a small percentage of near-death experiences. However, it does suggest that if you were Hitler, for example, and you were forced in your life review to experience moment by moment the pain that you caused in every single person who was affected by your behavior, that seems to me to be incredibly profound.
Yeah, that's 5 or 6 eons in hellfire there. It might not last forever, but like I say, it would seem like it was forever.
Well, Charles, this has been an interesting conversation. Is there anything that you'd like to bring up by way of conclusion?
It's important, I think, to understand more about the quality and possibilities of the afterlife. But if we get too glib about it and say, oh, yeah, I know how that works, something about the value of death, of the moment of truth, where, you encounter the great mystery and you have to put yourself in God's hands because you don't really know what's going to happen. You have to remember that too. Let's not get too lightweight about it, because I'm remembering, things on near-death experiences I've seen. Somebody has a book, The Joy of Dying, isn't it great? We've all been to this wonderful place, and we know that someday we'll get to go back. Isn't it lovely, Well, I hope you can go back, and I hope it will be lovely. And yet, death should be it should be magnificent and tremendous, and something that humbles us. Because if we get too glib about it, we may not go into it with the right attitude. That's what when I think about death, you remember Bergman's film The Seventh Seal, and where the night, Max von Sydow is playing chess with death. That's great. You think you can I think we think we can play chess with death and maybe win. But there was the point when the angel of death finally comes to the people, all except the young poet who, in his innocence, somehow is able to escape and come back and live a life on this earth. The actor, whatever he was, poet, actor, whatever he was. But death comes to them, and this is an amazing moment in cinematography where you just see their faces, looking upon death, looking upon, the mysterium tremendum, the great mystery, and, looking into the majesty, of death. Not horror, but not just, the eternal Caribbean cruise either. Looking at that face of the great mystery, and just that was wonderful acting. Imagine, talk about method acting, and look for how you would feel if you knew death was 3 feet away and staring calmly into the depths of your soul. And they did a wonderful job. So.
Well, I have one other thought I would like to bring up, and it has to do with the Eastern Orthodox tradition of the toll houses. The idea that, if I understand it correctly, it's a process whereby, bit by bit, before you can face the divine, you are stripped of all your pretensions.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that has to happen. Now, the Eastern Orthodox have a problem with purgatory, or with the word purgatory, because they say, well, we don't believe in purgatory, that's Catholic. But the thing is, they do believe that the soul is sometimes sent temporarily to hell for purification. So how that's different from purgatory, I can't tell you. And the toll houses is a doctrine that is not, it's not strictly dogmatic. It's a pious opinion that you're allowed to believe. And, such a great saint as St. John Maximovich of Shanghai and San Francisco, whose relics are in repose in the Cathedral of the Holy Virgin Joy of All Whose Sorrow on Geary Street. He believed in them, and essentially it's a little bit like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, not the Tibetan. And there's some icons where the soul is climbing a ladder and there are demons below trying to, yank the soul down to hell. Well, one of the reasons that some Orthodox don't like that idea is because it makes it seem like if you make a misstep in the next world, then you're damned. Whereas, that is a doctrine that can't be, that doesn't hold water. If in Christian terms you have accepted the atonement of Christ and, are willing to bear your cross, et cetera, then, sooner or later you're bound for glory. And so you don't have to worry about making a mistake in the next world and ending up in hell. But, there are states of purgation and there are delays in that process. The idea of the toll houses, it's like coming to a customs shed at a border, and they check your baggage and they check your papers, and, are they going to let you through? And each one of the toll houses has to do with, let's say, one of the 7 deadly sins or something on that order. And, if you've had more of a problem with one sin or another, you'll be there longer, sitting in the waiting room until, the bureaucratic process, the Kafkaesque bureaucratic process is finally completed, But there's really something to that, because those are different attachments and different veils over the heart that have to be removed before you are not just worthy, but are capable of being in the direct presence of God. So, it's an interesting doctrine. It's more like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, though, where you go through different levels in the other world, and you have to have the right passwords, and you have to say the right things to the different guardians. It's similar to that, but it's probably a little more morally sound, because it isn't just a technical process where you know the right words. You have to have the right disposition.
It also reminds me a bit of the myth of Inanna, the Sumerian goddess who passes through 7 gates and gives up powers, her godly powers, all the way until she enters the afterlife pretty much naked.
Yeah, and pretty much like a corpse down where Eresh Kigal reigns. Yeah, and that's very much like in the Vedanta. There's a divesting of the koshas, of the different sheaths of the Atma. The physical sheath, the emotional sheath, the mental sheath, causal sheath, whatever, the sheath of bliss, however that is said. And these are different levels of manifestation of the absolute, but that you have to go beyond the manifestations and the reflections and get to the thing itself. And actually, that's what Salome's dance of the seven veils was about. It wasn't given as that in, and I forget which of that is in tradition and which is in gospel itself. I see her as dancing before John the Baptist, and this is the soul divesting itself of the different veils that separated from the absolute. And when finally she's completely divested, then, she's supposed to ask for John the Baptist's head on a platter. So, he's beheaded and he loses his head. And in Sufi symbolism, that represents the loss of ego. That's the very symbol. The ego is headstrong. So, off with her head, the heart is central, but the head is always looking in one direction or another and is not completely at one with the heart. So the head has to come on.
Well, what a delightful, in a way, delightful conversation, Charles. Delightful and profound at the same time. And a great pleasure once again for me to be with you.
It's interesting because every time I do one of these, what I know about a particular subject sort of further gels for me, because it's great. It's great to do this because, it's good to see what you were just about to know, and then, see it a little more clearly.
Well, I know you write quite a bit about that fine, what would I call it, a vibration that comes off of the absolute, sort of the edge of knowledge.
Yeah, well, and that's what everything is, That's the logos. That's the what did I say? One of the things I wrote in that Sarfati group, it's like the primal vibration which the Hindus express as Aum is a vibration between the poles of existence and non-existence. Mm. That's the peak and the trough. There just begins to be a universe, and is the universe God or is the universe other than God? Well, you can't say one or the other. If the universe is God, then God is simply the collection of all the stuff, and you can't say that. But if the universe is other than God, then how could it even appear? So it goes back and forth between those two propositions, if you were, and that's the primal tone that the Hindus have done an awful lot of writing on, the primal tone of existence, that finally spreads out and becomes everything we see and everything we experience.
Charles Upton, thank you so much for being with me today.
As always, it's been a delight.
And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us.